Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Antiphon's defense speech. So the basic context of this is that at the end of the Peloponnesian War, the Athenian democracy is destroyed by the victorious Spartans. The Spartans set up a group of tyrants, 30 tyrants. They rule for a little bit, and then they're overthrown and democracy is restored. When the tyrants are overthrown, the people who supported the tyrants are put on trial, and Antiphon was put on trial. It's not clear exactly what the charge was necessarily. One source that I've read says that the charge has to do with basically being an emissary to Sparta for the tyrants. Another source talked about him outfitting a number of triremes, which were military ships, and providing a number of other resources, military resources and things like that for the tyrants. The way that Antiphon seems to present it is that the charge is somewhat broader in terms of participating in or supporting the tyranny against the democracy, particularly participating in a coup against the democracy. So that's the context. Antiphon makes this defense speech, and we think that this is Antiphon's defense speech. That seems to be the general consensus among scholars. I don't really know what the basis of that consensus is. We will take a look at the speech itself. I'll actually pull it up because it is quite short. The fragments we have of it are quite short. But this is actually one of the things that is kind of worth noting. One of the challenges of dealing with ancient materials is that they often survive only in fragments. So from this speech, we have 3 fragments. How accurate they are is unclear. Whether or not they all belong properly to Antiphon's defense speech as opposed to, say, somebody else's defense speech about similar charges, maybe not. It's a little bit harder to tell. And probably specialists in this who actually sort of dedicate themselves to studying Antiphon have a better sense of this. But this is one of the challenges with fragments, is that the identification of a fragment, so a fragment, for those of you who don't know this term, basically this is a small portion of a larger text, something that survives in another context. So often that will be either something that's been quoted by a different author. So Thucydides quotes Pericles' funeral oration, for instance. We don't have a written version of Pericles' funeral oration. If there ever was one, there probably wasn't. We don't have a written version of it from Pericles himself. What we have is Thucydides' version. So that's not necessarily a fragment, but often in philosophical or historical texts, you'll get like Antiphon has said X thing, or Sophocles has said X thing, Xenophon has said X thing, whatever it is, and somebody will write down just these bits and pieces of things. The other thing that we get in terms of fragments is recovered papyri, or sometimes stelae, things like this. Sometimes things will be carved in rock, or maybe even painted on rock on occasion. But a lot of times we'll find, like, here's a random scrap of papyrus in the desert, and it's got some writing on it. That sounds like Antiphon's defense speech. And so these are kinds of the things. I'm not an expert on fragments. I'm not an expert on how they identify them, anything like that. If you do know, tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear more about it. But that's sort of one of the challenges of dealing with fragments, is the identification may be uncertain. The other big challenge with fragments, as we'll see when we actually look at it, and I'll go ahead and pull it up actually, one of the other big challenges when dealing with fragments is they don't always make a lot of sense because they're often very, very short. And we'll see that with two of the fragments from the defense speech. So this is fragment 1A, this bit here. So this is the longer bit. Now, this was recovered from a papyrus, and it's not super clear to me from what I've read about this how certain the identification of this as Antiphon's speech is, but we know that this was a defense speech, and again, the consensus is that this is from Antiphon. So, what he says here, this opening line, the fact that this is in these sort of triangle brackets means that this is conjecture. So I read this as part of a Hellenic studies group here at Penn State. I was the only one in the room who doesn't read Greek, so that's always a little bit awkward. But the other people in the group, who are mostly classicists and philosophers who do read Greek, were looking at the actual Greek text and trying to figure out what things mean in the Greek and whether or not this English translation is exactly right. But this opening line here, we know, because it's in these brackets, that this is conjecture. So it starts, what was supposed to be my motive for conspiring against the democracy? Was it, and then we get into the more certain part. Was it that I had been selected for a public office where I had handled large sums of money and faced an accounting that I feared? Had I been disfranchised? Had I done you some wrong? Did I fear an impending trial? Surely I had no such motive since I faced none of these situations. Well, were you depriving me of property? Or was it because of wrongs done by my ancestors? Others desire a different form of government from the one they have because they want to escape punishment for crimes they've committed or take revenge for what they've suffered and not suffer in return. But I had no such motive. So this first paragraph is interesting because what Antiphon is essentially doing here is not necessarily addressing the specific charge. So if the specific charge is, as actually the editor of this version says, that he participated as an emissary to Sparta on behalf of the tyranny, he's not actually addressing that. He's not denying having done that. And actually, that's probably a smart move on his part because everybody knows he's done that. So there's not really room to make the argument, I didn't do the thing that you all know that I did. What he attempts to do is to say, I was justified. So this is what Aristotle in the Rhetoric calls forensic rhetoric, looking at the justice or injustice of particular actions. And essentially what Antiphon's argument here in this first paragraph is that I had no motive to want to overthrow the democracy. I had no motive to want to overthrow the government that existed. And the way he approaches this is essentially to say, here's a number of potential reasons I could have had to want to overthrow the democracy, but I didn't have any of these reasons. Now, this is an interesting rhetorical trick because it stacks evidence. It says, hey, here's a reason I could have wanted to overthrow the democracy, but I didn't have that reason. Here's another reason, didn't have that. Here's another reason, didn't have that. The problem with this technique rhetorically is that there are always more reasons that one could potentially want to overthrow the government. So this kind of depends on listeners or readers in our case, but listeners in the context of the Athenian court system to say, yeah, that makes sense. Those are the potential reasons you could want to overthrow the government, and you didn't have any of those, so you probably didn't want to do it. But if, as a juror, as someone who is hearing this speech, I say, but there's other reasons you could have wanted to overthrow the government, you could have had those reasons, then this defense kind of falls apart. So it's not fantastic necessarily. Then we've got this second paragraph of 1a, which says, my accusers say I used to compose speeches for others to deliver in court and that I profited from this. But under an oligarchy, I would not be able to do this, whereas under a democracy, I've long been the one with power because of my skill with words. I would be worthless in an oligarchy, but very valuable in a democracy. Surely then it's not likely that I desire an oligarchy. Do you think I'm the only man in Athens who cannot figure this out or cannot understand what is to my own advantage? So this is another interesting defense because, again, it relies on a kind of sleight of hand. Yes, there are going to be more court cases under Athenian democracy. Athenian democracy was famously litigious. There was continual court cases, and somebody who can write good defense or prosecution speeches, somebody who can write speeches that win cases and get paid to do that is going to make a lot of money. Under an oligarchy, there are still going to be legal cases, and there's still going to be people who would need training in rhetoric. I mean, Antiphon was a sophist. And sophist, one of the things that they did was they taught the art of rhetoric. Specifically, they taught the art of winning arguments. And that was one of the critiques that people like Plato make of the sophists, is that they are not teaching in the service of truth, they're teaching in the service of winning arguments. But this idea that because I wrote speeches and taught rhetoric, which is not specifically mentioned here, I'm more valuable under a democracy is not a bad argument necessarily. But to say I would be worthless in an oligarchy is also not quite accurate. So Antiphon is trying to sort of walk a middle ground here. And one of the things I think is really interesting about this paragraph is actually this last sentence here. Do you think I'm the only man in Athens who cannot figure this out or cannot understand what is to my own advantage? What he's doing here is setting up this observation. I would make more money under a democracy because of the number of court cases than I would under an oligarchy. He's setting that up as a matter of common sense. That's an interesting rhetorical technique. This idea that everybody already knows this. This is so obvious that everybody's already aware of it. For jurors, if they have not thought of this, if they hadn't looked at it this way, what that says is everybody around you has already figured this out. You're the dumb one. You should doubt your own assessment of this situation because everybody else has already figured this out. Now, what fragment 1a is really doing here, again, it's not necessarily addressing the direct charges. If the charge is under the tyranny, you acted as an ambassador to Sparta, he says nothing about that. What he's doing here is engaging the larger anxiety of the trial, right? Athenian democracy was fragile, especially at this point. This is 411, I think, BCE. Athenian democracy was very, very fragile. The Peloponnesian War had not gone well. Athens had lost. There was a tyranny, and then they had to restore the democracy. Democracy was fragile. Antiphon is addressing that anxiety. So rather than the actual charge, he's addressing the larger concern, saying, hey, if the concern is about me trying to overthrow the democracy, you don't have to worry because I don't want to do that. That's an interesting technique. It's not a bad rhetorical strategy, actually, especially in a case where, again, everybody knows he's done the thing that he's being accused of. So there isn't that much value in saying he hasn't done it. What he can do is say, you shouldn't punish me for it for these reasons. And that's going to be one of the reasons here, is I don't actually want to overthrow the democracy. I don't represent a threat to the current form of government. So that's cool. 1b, this is apparently the most secure in terms of we know this comes from Antiphon, because this is quoted elsewhere by a different author an admirer of Antiphon who specifically attributes it to Antiphon. So 1b, this is also a weird fragment. It says, on the charges brought by Apolexis that, like my grandfather, I was a political partisan, the ancestors would not have been able to punish the tyrants, but have been unable to punish their bodyguards. The other people in the Hellenic Studies group spent a good amount of time puzzling over the Greek here to try and figure out what this means. Because on the face of it, it doesn't make any real sense. The footnote says the argument apparently is that although Antiphon, like his grandfather, may have been on the side of those no longer in power, his grandfather was not punished for this, and so he should not be punished either. Logically, that makes sense. Grammatically, I don't have any idea how you get that out of the grammar of this fragment. So that one I'm not going to deal with too much because it is very, very confusing. We, in the group, proposed a number of potential readings, potential ways of making sense of it, but they're all very, very speculative. And then 1c, this last little bit here, I think is another interesting one. It says, the prosecutor asked that you not pity me, since he feared that I would try to persuade you with tears and supplication. What I think is cool about that one is this is Antiphon using his knowledge of rhetoric, using his own audience awareness to construct his defense, because he knows, well, he supposes anyway, that the prosecutor will say, don't take pity on Antiphon, even though he's going to cry, he's going to beg, etc., etc. And the reason that the prosecutor would say that is because the prosecutor knows that that's a standard defense strategy. So Antiphon is doing a sort of double bluff here, where he's saying, okay, here's me. The prosecutor thinks that I'm going to do this because the prosecutor, or I think the prosecutor is going to do this because the prosecutor thinks I'm going to do this. So rather than doing that, I'm gonna counter the point that the prosecutor is making based on what he thinks I'm going to do. That's a sophisticated set of audience awareness moves that depends on a complex knowledge of not only rhetoric, but the way that others perceive rhetoric. And that's really, really kind of cool on behalf of Antiphon. So I think it's an interesting last little fragment. So again, that's Antiphon's defense. Was it successful? No. We don't have any of the other speeches, the prosecutor's speech or anything like that, but we do know the outcome of this trial. Antiphon was executed. He was denied burial, which was a major, major disgrace for the ancient Greeks. So his body was basically just chucked out of the city. His property was confiscated, and his descendants were declared outlaws. So for somebody who had a spectacular career as a sophist, as a writer of persuasive speeches, his last one did not work out.